Hello there, welcome to Africa Live, CCTV's new program that brings you African and global news from all perspectives. I'm Raman Yang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Here's what else we have lined up for you in the next 30 minutes. Growing Africa's maritime sector, AU chairperson Dr. Dlamini Zuma calls for greater harmonization of trade agreements. And senior members of the World Anti-Doping Agency are in Jamaica to audit anti-doping efforts in the Caribbean country. Let's start, however, in Africa's biggest nation, where rebels in the eastern end of the Democratic Republic of Congo have abandoned a key military base. They have, however, vowed to fight on despite 4 days of a successful army offensive that has stoked tensions with neighboring Rwanda. Now, Rwanda, of course, does say 2 of its citizens have been killed by Congolese army fire since Friday when the fighting erupted after 2 months of relative calm. Now, Kigali, which has been accused by the UN of backing the M23 rebels, had warned it would not tolerate Congolese shells landing in its territory. A string of victories by government forces backed by a new UN intervention brigade has boosted belief that Congo's army could perhaps finally quell a 20-month insurgency which has displaced tens of thousands of people in a mineral-rich area. The UN Security Council held closed-door consultations in New York on Monday at France's request. The 15-nation body later on issued a statement that condemned the attacks by the M23 group, which claimed the lives of a Tanzanian peacekeeper on Sunday.
Mr. Kobler has briefed us, and basically he told us that we are witnessing the military end of the M23. So I think it's a positive development, of course, and there was a general agreement that now we should go back to the table of negotiation in Kampala. As you know, last week, Mr. Kobler and Mrs. Robinson told us that basically it was the M23 who refused to negotiate. So we hope that the rebel movement has been chastised and we'll go back to the table of negotiation. On the DRC side, the Minister of Defense has declared that Kinshasa was ready to negotiate. And eventually, we have agreed a press statement, and the press statement will be read by the presidency of the Security Council.
Now let's move on to a collection of other stories from across the continent. And we start in Cote d'Ivoire, where International Criminal Court appeal judges say that the former president of that country, Laurent Gbagbo, has to stay in custody ahead of trial on charges of orchestrating post-election violence in 2010. Gbagbo has been incarcerated in The Hague in the Netherlands for nearly 2 years now, and judges are yet to confirm his indictment or order him to stand trial. Prosecutors say some 3,000 people died in the violence by supporters of both President Gbagbo and President Alassane Ouattara in 5 months of violence after the 2010 Ivory Coast election, when Gbagbo refused to accept defeat. Meanwhile, over in Egypt, it has been announced that the Muslim Brotherhood Supreme Guide Mohammed Badi and his first deputy Khairat El-Shatter are set to stand trial over clashes in which several demonstrators were killed in the North African country. The announcement comes as the Egyptian Interior Ministry and the army continue their crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood as part of efforts to stabilize the country. The Brotherhood were elected to power in 2012, but they were later forced out by a military coup this year after mass protests against their rule. And finally, the worst locust plague in 60 years has infested roughly half the island of Madagascar, destroying crops and raising concerns of food shortages. Malagasy authorities say they don't have the resources to deal with this kind of natural disaster and are now calling on donors to pay for large-scale spraying in order to fight the plague. The locusts have already destroyed 50% of the country's rice fields, and that, of course, is a staple food of the Malagasy people. Now, Kenya Defense Forces deny that there was friendly fire that led to the death of one of the elite paramilitary officers on location at Westgate during the siege of that upmarket shopping mall in Nairobi. The Chief of General Staff, General Julius Kirangi, says that 2 soldiers have been dismissed from the force and the 3rd is currently under investigation for handling stolen property. Now, this, of course, is in relation to the Westgate probe. This, of course, is a developing story. You can keep up with the latest details on Twitter. CCTV's Robert Nagila at Robert Nagila, or rather at R Nagila, of course, has the latest details going on online. You can follow them over there. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up. Zimbabwe warns Mozambique conflict will hurt its regional economy. And the residents of Abyei awaiting results of the choice between joining Sudan or South Sudan, even though both countries don't officially recognize the vote. Now then, let's go back to our lead story at this hour. Of course, in the wake of Monday's meeting of the United Nations Security Council, specifically to deal with the DRC. In that particular part of the world, rebels over there of the M23 have abandoned a key military base, and it has been described in some quarters as the military end, if you will, of the M23. Let's get some more details on the situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We're now joined live from our Johannesburg studios by Stephanie Walters. She's an expert on the Great Lakes region with the South African Institute of Security Studies. Stephanie also runs Okapi Consulting. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. The current situation in the DRC, where the M23 seem to have been pushed out from their strongholds, does this, in your opinion, mean that we are about to see the end of the M23 as a military force?
I think it's too early to tell. Certainly this has been the most significant defeat that the M23 have suffered since they were able to take the eastern city of Goma last year. So this is extremely significant. But it remains to be seen. I mean, they have been pushed out of their key strongholds. But the real question here is, will they be allowed to die as a military movement? And essentially that will depend on whether Rwanda, which has consistently backed the M23, will now allow that movement to fade away, or will rearm it and allow it to essentially become revitalized.
The UN, of course, did send a combat brigade with a fairly robust Chapter 7 mandate in the DRC earlier this year. In light of what we're seeing now, do you think that combat, that intervention brigade, has delivered on the desired results?
Absolutely. We don't have that many details yet about how the Force Intervention Brigade, what role it played, but certainly that was a significant support to MONUSCO, the UN mission there, and to the FARDC. And we know that in past skirmishes between the M23 and the FARDC, this brigade has played an important role. This will have been its most significant deployment since it was completed, since its contingent was completed earlier this month. So, yes.
Indeed. The M23, however, isn't the only rebel group in the DRC. That country's eastern end, frankly, has just got wave after wave after wave of rebel groups. How best can the UN troops and the Kinshasa government clean out the country of these militia outfits, especially in the eastern end of the country?
Well, I think there are two things. Kinshasa does have to negotiate with some of these movements. I mean, some of these groups have very long-standing grievances relating back many years, having to do with abandoned integration programs. Some of them have political ambitions, but certainly Kinshasa has to deal domestically with those different armed groups. There also has to be a regional angle, because some of these groups do also have regional support. The UN now has this Force Intervention Brigade, which has a more robust mandate, and which is mandated, in fact, not just to go after the M23, but also to go after some of these other militia groups. But of course, a military solution on its own will not succeed. There has to be a political solution domestically and regionally as well.
Indeed. We'll have to leave it there, though. Thank you very much for your insights. That's Stephanie Walters, an expert in the Great Lakes region with the South African Institute of Security Studies, who also runs Okapi Consulting. Right then, let's move on to Mozambique. Reported fighting between government forces and Renamo-affiliated rebels in Mozambique is worrying quite a few foreign investors in that country, who are responsible for the country's promising economic growth so far. Now, even though reports of the situation in Mozambique always focus on the country's booming economy, its population does remain extremely poor, as CCTV's Guy Henderson now reports.
A penthouse view from the Grand Hotel. Abandoned on the eve of independence, reclaimed by a very different clientele. "5,000 residents surviving in the shadows of an economic boom." Take the occupant of Suite 309. 24-year-old Kimbo has known no other home. We're the forgotten people, he tells me. The government imagine we don't exist. They speak about employment. People here don't have employment. No running water or electricity. A home only for those with nowhere else to go. You can just imagine what this place might have looked like in its heyday. Well-heeled Portuguese expats walking down what would have been a carpeted stairwell, perhaps for drinks in the posh reception area. But now look at it, it's literally a crumbling relic of that past and a symbol of neglect. And yet wealth pours through here. This is one of the main arteries of a major resource boom.
Fazendo a comparação hoje, if we compare now to 10 years ago, I can say that Beira is feeling intense economic life based on several factors. It's risen because of the port and because of the coal and other mineral discoveries. They are using the port, and that has brought a new dynamic. Uma cidade que nasceu do serviço.
It's making some very rich, but, say opposition politicians, not all.
A população está muito zangada porque, primeiro é que
the people are very angry. 20 years of peace and all we can see is political terrorism. There is no effective distribution of resources for the people. A small group in government is keeping the wealth for themselves.
não há distribuição equitativa das riquezas em Moçambique.
Few are poorer than those at the Grand Hotel. Their voices all but forgotten. Guy Henderson, CCTV, Beira, Mozambique.
Now, renewed fighting in Mozambique is keeping its western neighbour on high alert. You see, Zimbabwe depends on the Mozambican port of Beira for most of its imports, and fears are high that escalating hostilities in Mozambique could thereby disrupt supplies and adversely impact Zimbabwe's anemic economy. Here's CCTV's Farai Mokutuya with the details.
Zimbabwe has a very bad memory of the civil war over its eastern border. The country was forced to deploy troops to safeguard its main artery to the outside world, the Beira corridor. So the recent violence in Mozambique has set the alarm bells ringing.
Any help which they request, whichever, Zimbabwe is ready to consider. And that may include, if need be, our re-engagement at a military level in Mozambique.
The leader of the opposition, Morgan Tsvangirai, says Zimbabwe should stay out of it. But business leaders here are also worried.
We have more than 1.6 billion litres of fuel coming via Beira. We have more than 200,000 of tons of wheat, which is 3/4 of what the country needs in terms of our bread and other statutory requirements. We also have key inputs like fertilizers, agricultural inputs, machinery and everything else coming into the country via Beira.
Alternative ports at Dar es Salaam and Durban are farther and more expensive. Rerouting to them cannot be done overnight. Mozambique's vast coal deposits are also seen as a potential solution to Zimbabwe's power shortages. Newfound coal deposits in Tete have also led to the development of 2 new ports there.
It means that Zimbabwe will have another, alternative northern corridor to the world market. So we really would want to have total peace in Mozambique so that the country can continue to do on the trajectory of development which has been the hallmark of Mozambique in recent years.
Zimbabwe is also concerned about the potential humanitarian fallout. More than 2 million Zimbabweans need food aid. The country is ill-prepared to handle any influx of refugees. Farai Mwakutuya, CCTV, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Now, across African borders, Chinese President Xi Jinping met with the South African Deputy President Kgalema Motlanthe on Monday in Beijing, pledging to further advance bilateral ties between the two countries. President Xi said the China-South Africa relationship has entered a fast track of development, with their cooperation heading in a solid direction over the last 15 years since they established diplomatic ties. Motlanthe said South Africa is ready to implement the consensus reached by the leaders of the two countries to strengthen the cooperation mechanisms, boost economic and cultural cooperation, and enhance coordination in international and regional affairs to elevate the bilateral relationship in a sustained way. Joining us now live from Beijing with the very latest, of course, is CCTV's Wang Xinye. What exactly does South Africa's Deputy President hope to achieve from this trip?
Hi Lama. Mr. Motlanthe came as a guest of his Chinese counterpart, Vice President Li Yuanchao, to attend the 5th meeting of China-South African Bi-National Commission. And on Monday, he talked to Chinese President Xi Jinping. Xi said this commission was formed after he met with South African President Zuma earlier in March this year, if you still remember. And he hopes that China and South Africa work together to make sure cooperation agreed by the two sides are put into practice. And Mr. Motlanthe said South Africa is willing to push the bilateral ties with China to a higher level. And this bi-national commission was formed to strengthen cooperations between the two countries in almost every key area, including foreign affairs, economy and trade, science and technology, education, energy and minerals. So before Mr. Motlanthe sat down with Vice President Li Yuanchao, officials from the South Africa's key ministries held meetings with their Chinese counterparts to discuss details of a wide range of agreements. At the end of the meeting, Li Yuanchao and Motlanthe attended the signing ceremony of a number of agreements. Back to you.
Indeed. These two countries, of course, have had fairly strong ties for well over a decade now. But what specific parts of their ties are they looking to strengthen in the near future, especially in the wake of this visit?
Well, China and South Africa maintained a frequent high-level exchange. Mr. Motlanthe himself visited China back in 2011 and talked to Mr. Xi Jinping, who was back then the Vice President of China. And earlier this year, Xi Jinping visited South Africa on his first trip abroad as the country's new top leader. And talking about bilateral ties, back in 2010, China and South Africa signed the landmark Beijing Declaration, lifting the bilateral ties to a comprehensive strategic partnership. And after that, cooperation boomed, especially in trade. So far, China is South Africa's largest trading partner, with current volume standing at $21 billion. And both countries are important members of the emerging economies. And 2013 also marks the 15th anniversary of the establishment of China-South Africa diplomatic relations. And Chinese experts believe constant negotiations like this one will help the two sides know better of each other and build mutual trust. Back to you, Lama.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that. CCTV's Wang Xinye live from Beijing with the latest details on the visit to China by South Africa's Deputy President Kgalema Motlanthe. Let's move on to the Horn of Africa, or more specifically to Eastern Africa, where tens of thousands of residents in the remote and disputed ABYEI border region between Sudan and South Sudan are awaiting results of an unofficial referendum which they hope will determine whether they will join Sudan or South Sudan. Now, the outcome is expected on the 31st of October, but it's not legally binding, and both Sudan and South Sudan say they will not recognize it. But the vote, however, is quite important for the majority of ABYEI residents who identify ethnically, culturally and religiously with the South. The chairman of the Referendum Commission says he expects a unanimous vote in favor of joining South Sudan, but that is a decision that is sure to antagonize heavily armed pro-Sudan Missouri nomads who drive their livestock through the region every now and then. ABYEI residents do hope, however, that the vote will bring peace and prosperity to ABYEI.
If it succeeds, life will not be difficult for my daughter. For too long there's been suffering. Our home was not conducive for human settlement. I hope she will not see all that. If we join South Sudan, everything will be available for her. There will be freedom for people to do what they want. I know she will be happy. The country will be good, there will be peace and stability. There will also be hospitals and employment opportunities.